Good morning. I'm Greg Grant from SCSP, and it's my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker, the Honorable Frank Kendall, Secretary of the United States Air Force. I had the good fortune of getting to know Secretary Kendall back in 2014 when my then boss, Deputy Secretary Bob Work, along with Vice Chairman Sandy Winnefeld, were putting together a group of fellow travelers to focus DoD on the challenges posed by China and their rapid military modernization. Frank Kendall was serving at the time as the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and he was raising the alarm to all who would listen about the erosion in the U.S. military technological advantage relative to China. It was Secretary Kendall who was saying, China, 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 long before it became cool in DC circles. And he argued that any new program, starts, or major capability investments must be made with China and its reestablishing U.S. technological superiority first and foremost in mind. The depth of knowledge, experience, and insight he has brought to DoD over his many years of service has been most impressive and has left quite an impression. Secretary Kendall is a change agent, and even though he is a graduate of West Point, he is exactly what the Air Force needs at this point in time to drive a transformation and to get that future force that is so sorely needed. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Kendall to the stage.
Well, good morning. I feel like I'm at a Friends of Ash convention here. I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of people who served along with Ash Carter and myself over the years. What I'm going to do is I want to say a couple of words about Ash because I've got the opportunity, and there's a segue from that into what I'll say about what I'm doing with innovation in the Air Force and Space Force right now. I met Ash Carter in 1980. I was a young Army captain serving in what was then the Army's Ballistic Missile Defense Systems Command in Huntsville. And this young guy came down to review some of our programs. Ash was working for the Office of Technology Assessment, Congressional Research Organization at the time. And he came down and I sat in as he heard briefings about what we were doing and asked questions. And I remember being really impressed with this young guy, thinking this is a really pretty sharp guy here. A physicist who was, deeply embedded in the details of missile defense technology. A couple of years later, the Strategic Defense Initiative started, and I got to work on that for the Army. And Ash has written a couple of books about missile defense. He's a real expert in missile defense. And so we got to interact occasionally. Once in a while, we were on a panel together. I remember being on a panel with Ash, and at the end, he came up to me and said, you and I really agree about this stuff. And I took that as a compliment. We then interacted at the beginning of the Clinton administration, where I was in the Pentagon as the Director of Tactical Warfare Programs and the Undersecretary for Acquisitions shop at the time. Ash came in and took on a policy role, and I got to see some of his breadth and depth across a lot of issues affecting national security beyond just the technical ones. We worked off and on together, and I left government a year or two later, but then we interacted over time. And when he came back as the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, he brought me in to be a member of his team and became my boss. I worked for him as his principal deputy for a couple of years before he moved up to be Deputy Secretary, and then I worked for him as Undersecretary. He left the government and came back in as Secretary, and I got to work for him in that capacity too. And we got to be pretty close. Ash was obviously brilliant. He was a hard charger. He wanted to get things done. I like to summarize him as someone who thought strategically and could act tactically very efficiently and effectively. Example of that was the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell. When I came in 2010 to join the Obama administration, Ash had already been chairing this group for about a year by then that Secretary Gates had asked him to put together. I think we got some veterans of that group here in the audience. And he was driving with tenacity and persistence to get things fielded to our warfighters as quickly as he could, to cut through red tape and make things happen. And he was being hugely effective at that. I remember going to the first couple of meetings and sitting on the side, watching him chair the meetings and drive things and make things happen. And I concluded after a meeting or two that this was a great job and I really wished I could do it, but I wasn't needed in that room at all while Ash Carter was there. So I stopped going to the meetings and I just sort of waited around hoping I'd get a chance to do it. When Ash moved up to become deputy secretary and I moved into the undersecretary job, the one thing he kept and he took with him when he became deputy secretary was chairing that group. And it says a lot about Ash, about his commitment to our people. He was very, very dedicated to our men and women. And his desire to see change happen, to really make things happen on the ground in support of a strategy. So when Ash left the department for a year or two before he came back as secretary, I finally got to chair the committee. But I had a great person to understudy during my period of that. And then Ash came back in, and one thing I would say about him as secretary, he was a man in a hurry. He had a lot of things he wanted to accomplish in about 2 years, and he checked that list off very, very effectively and efficiently. He was a friend, as well as a supervisor, as well as a colleague, and someone I admired enormously and still do. And as I'm in my current position, one of the things I do fairly frequently is ask myself, what would Ash do? And it's a good way to start to frame myself a little bit as I think about how to move forward, how to cut through the bureaucracy, how to move tactically in support of a strategy, how to achieve big objectives by piling up the small things that can lead to getting to where you want to go. And that euphemism about, what would Ash do, I think sticks with me, and I use it fairly often. I miss him a lot, I tell you. We used to talk almost weekly after we both left government. And I talked to him several times when I came back into this job. And he missed government. He missed public service. He missed the opportunity to make a difference. But he still does. The things that I'm doing are a direct outgrowth. The things that a lot of people you're going to hear from today are a direct outgrowth of Ash's leadership over the years. And I just wanted to make a comment about how much I miss him and how important he was to me and will be going forward and to a lot of other people. He loved to teach. I think he enjoyed the academic side of life as much as anything. And every now and then, quite often actually, I bump into someone who had the distinct opportunity and the privilege to be in one of his classes and learn from him. And they all say the same sorts of things about the interactions they had. Those are true with me too. I learned an awful lot from Ash and have benefited enormously from that relationship. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what I'm doing now. China. We have one strategic threat of real consequence. We can't ignore Russia. They have a lot of nuclear weapons. They have a reasonably modest-sized economy, and they're demonstrated a military that's not very competent just recently. But we can't ignore them. But the real strategic challenge to the United States is clearly China, and will be for the foreseeable future. And it's true that when I came back to government in 2010 to work for Ash, and I looked at the intelligence on what China was doing, it was quite obvious that they were modernizing their military with the intention of being able to just deter the United States from intervening in the Western Pacific, and if we did intervene, potentially to defeat us. And they've been working on that for a while. They watched what we did in the first Gulf War in 1991 and started moving forward with a set of capabilities that are designed to counter our ability to project power. And they were well down the road of fielding some of those capabilities. They were coming after our carriers, our forward airfields, our satellites, our key command and control nodes, our key logistics nodes. And they discovered that, quite obviously, frankly, that we depend upon those things to project power. And if you can attack those relatively small number of targets, you make it very hard for us to operate. And I did start raising alarms during the Obama administration and try to move our efforts more in the direction of countering what China was doing. Now that I'm back and have an opportunity to be with the Department of the Air Force, I'm trying to move the Space Force and the Air Force forward in response to the same threat. And we put together, and again, following an Ash Carter methodology, you got to understand the problem thoroughly, do good analysis, figure out what's going on, figure out what parameters matter and how you can influence them, and then move forward very quickly to try to field things and get them into the hands of operators. So that's the approach we've taken. I think I saw Andrew Hunter here. The general guidance I've given to Andrew and Frank Calvelli, who respectively have the Air and Space Force acquisition jobs, is I want program structure to get real capability, militarily meaningful capability into the hands of people as quickly as possible. I know you've been talking to a few people from the commercial world about innovation, and there are business terms that apply very well here. It's about competitive advantage. It's about creating value. It's about time to market. It's about return on investment. It's about all those things. But until you get real capability in the hands of customers, you're not going to get any return for your investment. So getting things out the door and in enough quantities to matter militarily is really what it's all about. In order to define what it was we were going to build, and I know Bob Work's going to be here later. He was one of my colleagues and supervisors as well. He's the author of the third offset strategy approach. I'm trying to finish Bob Work's third offset strategy job, at least for the Air Force and Space Force here. But in any event, you got to solve problems. What are the real problems you're trying to solve? What's the value added that you're going to bring to the table, if you will? And for me, it came down to a list of 7 what we called operational imperatives. These are operational problems we had to solve to be able to be effective against a threat that was emerging and moving forward fairly rapidly. China is not wasting any time. They're modernizing, and just in the almost 2 years I've been back in government, they have surprised me a couple of times, and they have moved forward significantly in terms of what they're doing. They're not waiting for us to do things. They're thinking ahead and moving forward. We have to be competitive and do the same. So the 7 operational imperatives went after 7 problems that I felt that if we solve those, and did this in coordination with Chief Brown, who will be here later, and originally General Raymond and now General Saltzman, there's agreement about this. If we can solve these problems, then we can get back to a position of significant advantage. I was asked by a reporter about a year ago when China might achieve parity with the United States. And my answer was, I think, a very honest one, is that there's no way to know that. And the reason it's so hard to know is it's very hard to know for certain ahead of time what the effectiveness of a lot of our weapons is. We haven't used them against each other for a very long time. And things like electronic warfare capabilities, cyber capabilities, countermeasures and countermeasures, seeker performance, things like that, reliability, are very hard to know until you actually use them operationally and have a chance to develop techniques to defeat each other. So China has gotten to a point where it's very hard to understand, hard to know for certain what would happen. But they've clearly been pursuing capabilities designed to make it very difficult for us to operate. In particular, precision strike, long-range weapons, and the things that support them. So the first of my 7 was Space Order of Battle. Under the Trump administration, of course, the Space Force was created. Under the Obama administration, we realized that space was a contested environment and a warfighting domain. And we changed our strategy and our policy to reflect that, but we didn't develop the programs and the force structure necessary to do that effectively. The Trump administration created the Space Force and started us down that path. And one of the things that I was very happy about when I came back into government 2 years or so ago was that the Space Force had done some really good thinking about what it needed to be in the future. And a lot of that was about disaggregated architectures and increased resilience. So we've continued down that path, and we're making good progress there. It also includes the capability to counter space. What China has fielded is not just the capability to come after our satellites that we depend upon, but also the capability to use our own satellites to target our joint force. So we had to counter that as well. And the Space Force has 2 fundamental missions: to provide services that enable and provide capabilities to the joint force that allow it to operate effectively. There's a range of those. And then to protect the joint force from attack that is based on space-based centers, in particular, of our adversaries. And so we had to fill out what we're going to do to actually do that and move forward. So we have a number of programs that do that. The second thing on my list was the implementation of JADC². JADC², Joint All-Domain Command and Control, for the Air and Space Forces is called Advanced Battle Management System, is the networking of our things together and the application of technologies like some forms of AI to make much better decisions much faster at scale in a large-scale operation. And my observation from being out of government for a few years and confirmed when I came in was that we really hadn't defined very well where we were going, what our product was going to be to achieve those goals. And that we need to do that and make sure everybody was aligned and supporting the actual creation of that product and fielding it. There were a lot of experiments going on, a lot of different pieces of things being done, but they didn't knit together necessarily into a whole that mattered. So that was number 2, was get that right, figure that out. Number 3 was the targeting side of things. Our airborne platforms like AWACS and JSTARS are becoming obsolete. They're not just old, they're vulnerable. And it's been determined, obviously, by the Chinese that there's something that is a high-value target that you benefit a lot from destroying, and they've decided to build the means to do that. And we want to move increasingly to space for those capabilities where we can. So targeting capabilities, particularly against moving targets. Our job for the Air and Space Forces, and generally for the Department of Defense, is to deter and defeat aggression. Aggression means forces moving somewhere to try to conquer whatever the objective is, whether it's land, generally in Europe, or in a maritime environment in the Pacific. So getting those moving targets into the targeting chain and then dealing with them effectively, but the first step in that is the targeting piece. So that was next, was doing all that effectively. And we've had great cooperation from the intelligence community as we move forward on those sorts of sensors to give us that capability. The next thing was the next generation of air superiority. The F-35, which Dr. Carter and I worked on for a number of years to try to field it efficiently and get to reasonable cost and so on and so forth, is now we're in about year 17 or 18 of production. That is not a brand new program anymore. It's been around for a while. Those technologies came out of, a couple of decades ago. So we need to get to the next generation. So that next generation is not just going to be the next fighter that we build. It's also going to be other things that can make it a much more cost-effective capability overall for air superiority. And we'll be introducing, under that operational imperative, we're introducing uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft that will be controlled by the manned fighter and used in a formation controlled by him. And we're moving forward to fund that and field that by the end of the decade, in conjunction with a new platform that would be the follow-on to the F-22, our premier air superiority fighter. And there are other things associated with that family of systems that give it a full integrated capability. The number 5 thing on the list is air-based resilience. And there, it wasn't as much about innovation and technology as it was about just doing the things that are necessary to make our air bases more resilient, to make our idea of moving to alternative air bases much more of a reality by pre-positioning equipment and buying things that we can actually use to make that happen. That's one operational imperative we can move forward with, and we are very quickly. Next on our list was our long-range strike capability. The B-21, which was just rolled out, is the centerpiece of that, but there are other parts that go with it, including off-board support, new weapon systems, and things to enhance its survivability against the threats that we see coming along. And then finally, all the things we depend upon to go to war. ASH was a big part of creating the Cyber Command and building it up to the capability that it is today. We had to be concerned about cyber vulnerabilities across the board, right? All the things we depend upon to go to war, as well as any specific physical nodes we count on that could be subject to attack. So that's my list. And we were able to put a lot of effort into the budget. I'm working really, really hard to get the Congress to move forward on these things. I'm looking for permission from the Congress to start earlier so I don't have to wait so long for approvals from the Congress. Pretty comfortable with where we are. And now going into a world in which we're going to have to wait for the Congress to act before we can move forward on a lot of these programs. There are about a dozen new starts that we put in our FY24 budget, as well as a total of at least 20 things that have increased funding. And I can't get up in front of any group and not talk about continuing resolutions and how harmful they are to the department. So I'm going to have to make that plug. You may hear that from a few other people today. So we're moving forward. We've got all of those things in the budget. We're continuing the work. It never stops. It is a competitive game. It's a highly competitive game, and it's probably as serious strategically as any I've ever been involved in. Innovation is at the heart of this, but getting things from the laboratory and the experimental phase into real products in the hands of operators is really what we're all about. General Brown's going to talk to you later. He had a phrase that he used, which I've piggybacked on repeatedly, which is accelerate, change, or lose. And he's absolutely right. He's also got a phrase he's been using called integrated by design, which is the idea that under our strategy of integrated deterrence, we design to be our products so that they can work with our partners and our allies. And the proliferation of F-35 gives us a great opportunity to do that across a number of a larger, increasingly growing number of countries. So we're united in our purpose. Innovation is at the heart of it, and it's not just technical innovation, it's operational innovation and developing tactics for that uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft, working in conjunction with a manned fighter that I talked about as an example. We're very serious about this stuff. The space things that are funded are going to move forward to quick fielding. We're piggybacking on what Derek Trenier has done at the Space Development Agency to capitalize on commercial developments in terms of simplicity of design and manufacturing processes to field large numbers of satellites relatively inexpensively. Derek just launched, SDA just launched their first tranche of satellites. So we're very motivated. We're moving as quickly as we can to get things into the field. We need the support of Congress to do this. I'm most concerned right now, my biggest strategic worry, if you will, is that we'll end up with a year-long CR and we won't be able to move forward in all these things that we've sent up to the Congress. We're now in a mode of waiting for them to act, and I'm afraid that that may go on for some time and tie our hands when we most need to be moving forward quickly. The other thing that I'll mention in the innovation side of the house is that General Brown, General Saltzman, and I are going to be reviewing all of our S&T programs. And what we're going to review them for is their viability. And we're going to ask the question, okay, first of all, if this is a successful experiment, will we buy it? And if the answer to that is no, we need to put the resources into something else. I'm going to say a word or two about the value of death, which I'm sure will come up a few times during the day. There is a lot that has been done, and Ash did a lot of this in creating things like DIU and SCO on one side of the valley of death. And that's the side of the valley where you find the technology and you mature it to the phase where you can make a decision about whether you want to carry it forward and field it or not. We have done a lot on that side of the valley, and we have a lot of options over there. I think they're basically reasonably well understood by leadership now. The problem we've got getting them across the valley is about resources and requirements and decisions that we need to make about what we want to actually put into our inventory, and then getting the resources to make that happen. So what General Brown and Saltzman are going to do is go through all our projects, and we're going to identify the ones we think have high promise, and we're going to fund them for fielding. We're going to make sure there's funding not just to do an experiment, but to actually move them and get them into the inventory as quickly as we can. The one feature of what I've done with the operational imperatives that I think is important here is that I've teamed operational people with technical people to lead the effort on each of those operational imperatives. That marriage, I've got a lot of decades of defense acquisition, and one of the things that has plagued the enterprise in that regard is the separation, the artificial separation between requirements and acquisition, where one set of people, operators generally, will write requirements, hand them over to the acquisition technical people to build them, and then that's it. They wait then for the product to show up that meets all their requirements. There has to be a partnership there, and this is very much a current industry practice. There has to be a partnership between the customer and the developer so that you end up getting the product that efficiently meets the needs of the customer. And our history has been to be very aspirational over here, write unrealistic requirements, work on them for a long time, realize they're impossible, and then either kill the program or make very painful adjustments. We need to do a better job of that. And one of the successes of the work that we've done on operational imperatives, as far as I'm concerned, is that we made that lasting marriage happen where those people are working in partnership. And they're bringing in others that cut across a lot of different boundaries that are artificial to define what we're going to do in a way which is there's good agreement upon, and there's good, well-founded definition of the product. So the combination of that, plus the senior involvement in looking at the options that we have and making some decisions about what's really attractive and what isn't, and making some commitments is the way I think we're going to move forward much more effectively. Time is not our friend. We do have a pacing challenge that is running very fast to try to stay ahead of us. And one observation about China is they're not just developing things to deal with the capabilities we have now. They're thinking ahead to what we're going to do next and trying to develop things to counter that before we get it into the field. So we have got to move fast. Our system isn't set up to do that. The other real comment I'll make, and then I'll open it up for questions for a few minutes, is that I'm back in government partly because I think my experience of 20 years with a strategic competitor who was a pretty close technical competitor and fairly well resourced, the Soviet Union, that 20 years of the first 20 years of my career, from 1970 to 1990 roughly, is really relevant now. And there aren't that many people around who remember what that was like. Ash Carter would have been one of them. And I bring that back because we spent the last 30 years with an assumption of US dominance that is no longer valid. And we've spent the last 20 years roughly fighting counterinsurgencies and being very careful about engaging largely individual targets. We have now got to prepare ourselves for a very different type of conflict that is more reminiscent of what might have happened in the Fulda Gap in the 80s. So that experience, I think, has value. And if there's one thing I'm trying to communicate above all else, it's a sense of urgency about moving forward. And I can think of no better example of somebody who had a sense of urgency about what he did than my good friend and colleague, whom I miss very much, Ash Carter. So let me stop with that and give you a chance to ask me a few questions. Thank you. I can't see the hands. I got one way back there. Okay. I don't know if they have mics to go around or not.
They do.
Yeah.
Sir, Sidney Friedberg from Breaking Defense here in the blinding haze. You mentioned the year-long CR as a chronic worry. Are there other things in the upcoming markups, poison pill provisions or misguided provisions that you're worried about, short of the year-long CR, things that even if they pass a bill would concern you and you urge Congress not to do?
I've had good cooperation from our committees. The chiefs and I just finished our 4 hearings with our different oversight committees. And one of the things that's been a sticking point in the past that we're getting good cooperation on now is divestitures. Programs like the A-10, some of our AWACS is another good example. Weapon systems that were really great in their time and have served us extremely well, which are becoming increasingly obsolete and very expensive to maintain. So we're having to divest some of those to free up resources to move forward. And there's been resistance to that in the past. But we were successful with the exception of the A-10s 2 years ago. Last year we were successful with our A-10s initial retirement. We were unsuccessful with F-22, old F-22s that are not fully combat capable last year. I think there's a much better chance that'll go through this year. So I want to express some appreciation to the Congress. I know it's hard locally in particular to divest aircraft that are in your communities. And we're trying to replace aircraft we divest with like aircraft where we can, fighters with fighters, for example. And if we can't do that, we try to replace a flying mission with a flying mission. And where we can't do that, we put in another mission that's going to have a lot of longevity and bring similar values to local communities. The truth is that the Air Force needs things like electronic warfare, battle management, intelligence, cyber capabilities, all of these things. It doesn't just need airplanes, it needs a lot of other things. And as the character of warfare changes and as technologies are introduced, we're going to need those kinds of units just as much as we're going to use more traditional platforms. So far we've had pretty good support on that. I have a legislative initiative on the Hill that would allow us to not wait so long to be able to start programs. It's an initiative that in talking to leadership, I've had pretty good support for, but I'm afraid there's going to be some resistance to this. Essentially, the legislation would allow us to start a program whenever we're surprised technically by the threat or we see a great opportunity and not have to wait for an entire budgeting process. We finished the work on the operational imperatives that I talked about a year ago. And we put it into our POM, our budget submission to OSD, basically. Spent several months, finalizing the Department of Defense budget and getting it to the Hill. It's up there now. We just did testimony. Now we're going to wait. If it was a year that we haven't seen for about 15 years, we'd get bills before the end of the fiscal year. I don't expect that. The norm has become a 3-month CR, roughly. But I think there is some political potential for an even longer CR this year, the point I mentioned earlier. So the legislative initiative would allow us to do early stage, very inexpensive preliminary design work, system engineering, requirements trade-offs, maybe some risk reduction, take us up to what's called the preliminary design review point, and not go beyond that. So it would allow us to, through reprogramming or a couple of budget lines we have, get programs started, get industry involved, get things moving forward. That's very inexpensive. And I think of this as low-hanging fruit. It's a free year and a half or so that we're giving away to the other side while we wait for our bureaucratic process to play out. And the Congress would still have full oversight. We would not be able to go beyond preliminary design review without their approval in a budget cycle. So there's still be plenty of opportunity for Congress. And we're asking for this as a pilot, basically with $300 million of cap on it initially. That would be enormously helpful. And it would, if I have heard anything from Congress over the years, it's you're too slow. Well, here's a way we get a year and a half, and it's basically free as far as I can tell. And it doesn't, the Congress could watch and make sure we didn't abuse this in any way. And they would ultimately have authority, full authority over all these programs. We just get a chance to get a little bit of a head start on them. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be saying a lot about and did in my hearings and will continue to. So overall, I don't see any big poison pills that I'm terribly worried about. I think we have both sides of the aisle. One nice thing about being in the Defense Department is that the committees you deal with in particular, Republican or Democratic, they're pro-national security. And they are supportive. They have different ideas about what level the budget should be at, and that's all negotiable. But overall, the support's been really good from our committees. Okay, see if I can see. I got one right here.
Sir, Dr. Marina Theodotou, Defense Acquisition University. People innovation readiness is one of the critical elements to get our people more innovative from A to B and give them the culture that they need to be innovative. Do you believe that in addition to technological innovation and operational innovation, people innovation readiness could be the cross-cutting element across your seven imperatives? Thank you.
Great question. Yeah, people are everything. Talent is everything. There are a number of aspects of that. My Cold War observation was that the Air Force at the time was, and I'm being biased now probably, was the strongest technical service. It had a great cadre of science and engineers spread throughout the Air Force, doing a lot of actual work and learning from it. I was an Army captain, and I got into the program management business, but I was working in support of what was then the Peacekeeper program that the Air Force was doing. And my training as a program manager was essentially by on-the-job training from Air Force colonels who were fantastic at it. And they were my model and still are of an effective program manager who's, as Bill LaPlante would say, they know their technical baseline, they own it, they understand their product, they're hands-on, they're involved on basically a daily basis, and they're intimately involved in driving forward, and they have the technical base to be able to do that very effectively. So that's my model essentially, and has been throughout my career for good program management. Most of what we do is engineering development. That's the hard part of a program, is getting the product to market. And that's about engineering and supervising engineers largely. So an observation that's been confirmed by a lot of people is that capacity in the Department of the Air Force atrophied after the Cold War ended. And I'm trying to rebuild it. We're emphasizing that kind of background in promotion boards and so on. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I discovered a few months ago that for promotions to major and lieutenant colonel, the Air Force was masking advanced degrees. And I had a paragraph I'd inserted into the orders for boards, the direction of promotion boards, that science and engineering and STEM capabilities and things like AI and cyber and so on are important to us. So we want that kind of background where we can get it. We encourage people to get degrees in those fields. And the next paragraph said, and we're going to hide your advanced degree from the board. I said, there's a little inconsistency here, so reversed it. And what the background on that is that our promotion system in the Air Force didn't give boards much to distinguish by. Everybody had glowing reports, right, about everything. So having a degree or not became a go, no-go for promotion of these grades. And everybody felt they had to have a degree. So people, all the pilots in particular, went out and got degrees in anything they could get a degree in as easily as possible so they could have an advanced degree and check the box. And that's ridiculous. We don't want that. We want people to get degrees or have value to us. So the solution to that problem was not to hide the degrees. It was to have a better basis by doing promotions than whether you have a degree or not. So of all the things I've done in the Air Force, this is the one that probably got the most attention, because all the captains and majors in the entire Air Force suddenly were worried about whether they had to have a degree or not. It has not changed board results, but it is now a more consistent position that we're taking by far than we were before. Same thing is true on the civilian side. We're trying to enhance our capability there. We're trying to tap into industry more effectively. It's not just about people in government. Again, going back to the Cold War, we used to have a much more open relationship, I'll say, and a closer relationship with industry during the Cold War. And many times in my earlier career, if we had an operational problem, a technical problem we needed people to address and try to attack for us, we would pull together a team from both government and industry and just put them in a room and let them work on the problem for a while. It's almost impossible to do that now because of all the rules in place about conflict of interest and so on. I'm all for that. I'm all for the solid ethics, but I'm not for getting in the way of making progress. And in some cases, I think we've gone too far in that regard. And I'm encouraging Andrew and Frank, our two acquisition executives, and our other people, to interact more with industry, bring them in early. As we were doing the operational imperative analysis work that first several months, we reached out to industry to get their ideas. And one of the things that the list of the 7 operational imperatives did was it gave industry some indication of what problems we were trying to solve, so they could hopefully put their brain power to work on them and come in with creative, more competitive answers to some of our questions. And I think that's worked out reasonably well. We need to continue to do that. Industry is part of our team. They obviously are trying to make money, and we have to protect the government's interests in that regard. But we need to get that brain power, that human capital, if you will, energized and working on the problems that we want to solve. And that's not just true in the traditional defense companies. It's true in a lot of other places. You're going to hear from Dr. Hicks, Deputy Secretary Hicks later today, and she's going to talk about a number of things we're doing to try to broaden our impact and broaden our access to technology and bring in creative ideas. And the commercial world is moving forward, obviously, in a lot of areas much faster than the traditional defense world is. And we need to tap into that and bring it in. I think I can probably do another one. How am I doing on time? I'm done. I'm told I'm done. Let me do one more real quick. You took your break early, right? So, okay. I got one more out there. I'm looking. Back here, way back.
Okay. Hey, sir, thank you for going over the operational imperatives and also for oxygenating from the private sector into government. My question is, would like to hear how you're thinking about foreign ownership, control, and influence across the acquisition programs. How do you think about de-risking and decontaminating the supply chain for all these important areas? Thank you.
I think your question was about keeping foreign access out for protection of data, or what was the?
In the acquisition programs, foreign ownership, so particularly from China.
We're working with our partners more than we have traditionally. We're actually buying some products that are not origin in the U.S. now. And I don't think I've seen that a lot earlier in my career. We have a lot of very strong partners out there, and integrated deterrence isn't just about security relationships. It's also about relationships on development. It's also about interoperability. The U.S., ambassador from Australia, told a story about how he was in China. He's a former prime minister and he speaks fluent Mandarin, and he had lived in China. He was in China speaking at a conference, and it was mostly Chinese generals. And after he spoke, one of the generals came up to him kind of semi-privately and said to him, among other things, "So why do you have all the good allies?" And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Australia has the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has, Europeans. It has Japan. It has, South Korea. It has the Philippines. China has North Korea. These are very valuable partners to us. They're very capable partners, and we need to utilize them as much as possible. I mentioned the proliferation of the F-35 earlier. That's really going to give us a lot of opportunity, I think, to be more effective together. And we're leaning forward more than we have been historically in terms of sharing technology. And we're also using more foreign technology from our close partners than we had before. I'm going to go to an event later this week on AUKUS, which is a very close, tight cooperation and large scale between the US, Australia, and in the UK. So allies are a really big part of the equation, and we're trying to break down some of the barriers to flow of information so that we can work together much more effectively. Okay. All right, I think I'm getting a hook here. Thank you very much. Enjoyed being with you.